Now, I'm not going to insult the movie. I'm not going to say that it was a bad movie. It absolutely wasn't a bad movie. It was a good movie. They went through a lot of painstaking, sacrifice, and they spent a lot of money in order to make this movie. In fact, I kind of think it was kind of a bad decision to have Tom Cruise actually show up at the beginning of the movie prior to the movie start to actually tell you, how hard they worked on the movie. Because I think it kind of hurts the suspension of disbelief that you're actually in a movie theater watching a movie. Like for instance, it's like you come in, you know that there's going to be this big Hollywood blockbuster movie, and you have an actor from the movie literally tell you before the movie comes on, we hope you appreciate this movie and everything. It's like, I don't think that was really necessary because, again, I think that kind of hurt my ability to settle in my seat and say, yeah, I'm watching a movie. So, as they're saying, the F-18 actors that they used were only allowed to be in those jets after they went through training and after they went through ejection training and after they went through water immersion training, so that this way, just in case, one of these things blows up or crashes, they'd be able to survive. So, the Navy or the military, the Defense Department, they weren't going to take a chance that, somebody could get hurt in one of these things, which, absolutely could happen. But I really actually like the fact that they used authentic footage, because back in the 80s, obviously they used stock footage, which can be seen, like if you pay very close attention to the ordnance and everything on the planes, it changes from scene to scene in some cases. The F5s from the country that we were supposed to be fighting painted black and this, that, and other. All of that stuff was stock footage basically taken from F-14 training. So, it's like they did a really good job putting this movie together. I felt the CGI scenes that were there blended in pretty well with the real live action scenes. So basically, the actors were always in the co-pilot seat of these jets, and the actual pilot was flying, so that this way that they could capture the realism of somebody like bobbing and weaving around in the seat because of the G-forces and because of these quick turns and everything. So I'm going to say, realistically, this movie is definitely going to be considered a 5-star movie. Some people may rate it as low as 4, but I don't think it'll get much lower than that. I think what really saved the movie was the fact that it had plenty of humanity, which is something that they had in the first one. See, the sad thing about it is a lot of these copycats that tried to copy the Top Gun movies, they made them technology heavy and stock footage heavy, but they couldn't capture the humanity. And very few movies from the 80s actually managed to capture the humanity of a fighter pilot. Top Gun was one, and then Iron Eagle was another one. And Iron Eagle was actually a pretty good movie, despite the fact that it was absolutely ridiculous in every single way. But if you're a kid in 1980s like I was, and you're watching it, you're not going to think about any of that. You're just going to watch it, and you're just going to enjoy it, and you're going to love it for what it is, It was, a story about camaraderie, a story about friends who happen to be, a pilot and his weapons operator. And then you've got, in Iron Eagle, you got a boy trying to rescue his father from the entire Middle Eastern army, and somehow he manages to pull it off with Lou Gossett Jr. It's like the 80s was like, they made very good movies back then. And, I have to say, this movie, Top Gun Maverick, was definitely worth watching on the big screen. I'm disappointed that it took so long for this movie to come out, because I was ready to see this movie prior to COVID. Maybe it aged better. Maybe it'll do better. But I think if this movie come out before COVID happened and closed down movie theaters, I think this movie would have definitely done a lot better faster. Because now, some theaters aren't open. Some theaters have straight up closed down and shut down. And then, this movie will be in theaters for a while, and then they're going to put it on demand, and it'll probably make way more money on demand. But then the question is, who's going to show it? Is it going to be HBO Max? Is it going to be Netflix? Is it going to be Showtime? Whatever. Epics. So there's a whole lot of questions now, and this movie deserves to make its budget back. I hope. I'm pretty sure it will. People don't buy DVDs and Blu-rays anymore, but the reality is, the post-COVID world is not the same as the pre-COVID world. And when I say that the post-COVID world is nothing like the pre-COVID world, I should also say that the present-day American military is nothing like the military of the 1980s. When I was a kid and I saw Top Gun in the theater, yeah, just like pretty much every other kid who saw it, they wanted to be a fighter pilot, or they wanted to be a pilot at least. Never mind the fact that Goose got killed by ejecting and hitting his canopy. They weren't worried about anything like that. Basically, they thought that being a pilot was just that you're flying around and shooting down enemies and blowing shit up. The reality is, we haven't had a dogfight in God knows how long. Now, I can't speak for those special op missions and shit where you'll never hear about it or never find out about it. But the reality is, we've been at war with terrorism since, 2003, when Bush basically unilaterally somehow declared war on Iraq and Afghanistan simultaneously. And they never had a sufficient air force. They never had sufficient air defenses. But in this movie, we're led to believe that Maverick is going to be inducted as a Top Gun trainer in order to train a crop of new pilots to basically pull off a Star Wars Death Star exhaust port bombing, just like they did in that movie. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, wait a minute, this is absolutely ridiculous. And the funny thing about it to me was the possibility of, say, using stealth fighters is quickly brushed aside as if, no, we just can't do it. And they said something about this radar jamming, and I'm like, stealth fighters don't give a fuck about radar jamming. They do what they do, whether radar is being jammed or not. Stealth fighters don't care about radar jamming. In fact, some of them have active radar jamming themselves, and they would be the most logical thing to use in order to pull off a mission like this. The F-22 and the F-35 carry joint direct attack munitions, which are basically bunker-busting bombs. In fact, during the Bush administration, he suggested that they have nuclear-tipped JDAM bombs. So they weren't going to use a nuclear weapon in this movie, but the point was, it was like they needed a reason to have to use the F-18s. And unfortunately, the F-18 just isn't visually as dramatic as the F-14 was. I would say the F-22 would have been a better choice for visual drama, but I guess after seeing the movie Stealth by Sony, I guess they probably just didn't want to do that. I guess they've been always trying to recreate a Top Gun movie, but the F-14 just, for whatever reason, I guess it's because of the moving parts, the F-14 just seemed to be a better star for these type of movies. And the Japanese loved it, so they've copied it with their Robotech and all that. But the reality is, it made more sense to use a stealth bomber for this mission, because a stealth bomber could get close to the ground, blow these ports up, and then get out of there. Not only that, they'd be able to take on the enemy's fifth-generation fighters. And it's so funny. First of all, the country that you're supposed to be basically at war with is never named. Now, in the first movie, it was pretty much assumed that you're at war with Libya, and they were going to use those anti-ship missiles to blow up your ships. But in this movie, they never named the country. Now, what country do you know is going through pains to do secret underground nuclear weapon development? The only answer that would come to mind is Iran. China isn't doing that. Russia isn't doing that. They already have nuclear weapons, and we know about them. North Korea really doesn't have to do that because they can just test their bombs underground. They're not building nuclear ground. They're not building nuclear reactors and shit underground in order to make fucking weapons grade plutonium. They ain't got the money for that. So the question is, what country are we able to go and bomb and blow up their nuclear research, but they have no ability to attack us back? See, the thing about it is the America of the 1980s could do whatever it wanted to these smaller countries like Libya and even Afghanistan and whatnot, or even Iraq. We could get away with it then. And Iraq actually had effective air defenses up until, we blew all that shit up. But the thing about it is there's no country that we could go to war with. And you understand, if you bomb somebody's nuclear facility in this manner, you're at war with them the next day. So what country has that kind of money to develop secret underground nuclear facilities, but has fifth generation fighters just sitting around? And mind you, they never named the fighter. They never just came out and say, yeah, this is the Su-57 Felon. They just said, nah, we got some fifth generation fighters, guys. You have to go in, blow it up, and you got to get out of there before the fifth generation fighters get you. They kept saying fifth generation fighters. I'm like, well, why don't you just call it the Felon or make up a name? But they didn't want to do that. So I just thought that was kind of odd. I really felt the entire mission was preposterous. It was as preposterous as Luke Skywalker using the Force to fire 2 missiles down a exhaust port that's only a couple of meters wide. It was really preposterous. But the thing about it is, if you know nothing about aviation and you know nothing about the F-18 or its weapon systems, it could pass. Most people in the audience don't know any of this shit. They just see special effects and they just drool, and that's about it. But, it was a good movie. I just felt the story was preposterous. The Penny Benjamin subplot, I think it was sad that they didn't bring Kelly McGillis back, but the problem is she's old. It's like the reality is if they're going to put a woman in a movie, they're going to make her young. Ageism is real. They're not going to put Kelly McGillis in this movie. She's too old. She's not sexy enough. So what do? They go to get Penny Benjamin, who really, after all this time, you're talking about 36 years later, she should have aged out. In the movie, she's a single mom. Tom Cruise is a simp. Maverick is a simp, so Maverick is trying to wife up the single mom. The daughter looks at him and is like, oh, just don't break her heart again. And I'm like, Tom Cruise, you're supposed to be smarter than this, Maverick. You're supposed to be smarter than this. You're a simp. What are you doing? Like, first of all, being a stepfather is like financing another man's orgasm. What are you doing? What are you doing? But he was determined to get Penny Benjamin, so much so that he, broke those laws about buzzing the con tower and whatnot. And I just thought that was the other thing that was interesting about this movie. This movie praises insubordination. And I'm like, dude, it's like you steal an F-18 to go on a training mission. You fly the Skunk Works stealth fighter, whatever it is, at speeds that they told you not to fly it at. I'm like, you'd be facing like multiple court martials by the time this movie's over. I'm like, this is crazy. It's absolutely just wild. The real relationship that they want you to pay attention to mostly is between Tom Cruise and Goose's son. Now, I actually kind of thought that it was odd that you could have a relationship like that where Tom Cruise could have any power whatsoever over Goose's, how should I say, his records or his ability to be promoted. Because it seems to me that somebody in the Defense Department would have said, wait a minute, you obviously have some kind of emotional issue or you have some kind of relationship issue with this person because you were in combat with this person's close family member and that person died and you haven't been the same since. It's like, I can't imagine that the DOD would allow you to get that close to somebody to the point where now you're deciding whether or not they go on a mission or not. Because, if you're personally involved, that means that you could not allow them to go on certain missions because you're afraid of losing them, or you could be putting them on certain missions as nepotism. So it seems to me that the DOD wouldn't allow that. But that's just me. The other relationship that we're expected to care about is the Val Kilmer Tom Cruise relationship, Iceman and Maverick and whatnot from the first movie. So Val Kilmer in real life had cancer, and in this film they weave it in there, and they use Val Kilmer. He's now an high-ranking admiral and whatnot, but he's retired, and he's basically been watching over Tom Cruise. He's basically been like a guardian angel. I actually thought that was very interesting. But see, they did a really good job with the relationships in the movie. So it's again, I'm just saying, this wasn't a bad movie at all. It was actually a good movie. I have to say I'd give it either 4 or 5 stars, depending upon how I'm feeling. I have to say the first movie was superior. The first movie was perfect, despite they made lots and lots of mistakes with all of the actual on boat, the saluting and the uniforms and the pilotry and all that. They made little mistakes, but the thing about it is when you're a 4 or 5 year old kid, you don't care. You came there for that soundtrack. The 80s had the best soundtracks. You came there to watch them shooting down other fighter pilots, and you came there to watch them blowing shit up. Top Gun, the original, can't be surpassed. It's a classic in every single way. Top Gun Maverick is a sequel in every single way. It's not an instant classic. It's a good movie, but it's not an instant classic. The relationships in the movie were good. The humanity in the movie was okay. For some strange reason, it feels to me like the fighter pilots that were in the original movie, they seem to resonate more despite the fact they had less lines and they also had less screen time. But it was the things that they were saying that I think made them stand out more than the fighter pilots in this movie. I can't remember a single thing about most of the pilots in this movie where I can remember it from the first movie. Maybe it's because I've seen the first movie so many times, but just their lines were delivered in a way. It's just like when Maverick said, yeah, I'm going to hit the brakes and he'll fly right by it. And the guy says, you're going to do what? It's like, I don't need to know who he was, but even with just the few lines that he had, or when he was talking to Maverick trying to get him back into the fight, it was like, it was like it was just the I don't know if it was the cinematography or if it was the lines or if it was the lack of lines. But it's like, it's like they say, sometimes if you say less, that actually produces more effect, especially when you're talking about a movie. So again, I like the movie. If you can, go see it on the big screen. It's absolutely worth the money. I hope I didn't spoil much because, the trailers kind of gave away a little bit too. So, it was a good movie. It's definitely worth watching. I give it 4 or 5 stars.